We're trying to make the cost of storage so cheap that when paired with renewables, solar plus storage is going to be cheaper than gas. Time is your worst enemy. You need to understand the trade-offs between spending money and losing time. Underinvesting, it is going to cause big problems down the roads. Utilities are allowed to earn a rate of return on the capital cost of things they build. They're not allowed to earn a rate of return on the operating of those assets.
Welcome back to Clean Techies, the #1 podcast for climate tech entrepreneurs. Today we are speaking with Arvin Ganesan, the current CEO of Fourth Power. There's a good chance you've heard of Fourth Power as they hit the market with a big splash when they announced their Series A funding round of $19 million. Investors include Breakthrough Energy Ventures, DCVC, and Black Venture Capital Consortium. They are solving the problem of storing all the renewable energy by heating up rocks, which are able to store the energy for a very long time, and they only lose a minimal amount of energy while sitting still, or while just kind of keeping that energy there. Then, when the time is right, they hit the switch and the energy is deployed. What's really interesting is this discharge is actually faster than the time it takes to start a peaker plant, which is a small gas power plant that is usually used and turned on to meet peak energy demand during the day, at least conventionally speaking. On top of this tech being just absolutely incredible, Arvin also brings an amazing background. He started out in investment research, then landed in the policy world, where he eventually worked in the EPA during the Obama era. From there, he ended up doing global energy policy with Apple to help them purchase renewables. Fast forward a bit, and he gets tapped to come in as CEO of Fourth Power. Today, we've got a great show for you, so enjoy. But before you do, we do have an ask. I know we ask this every episode, but there is a reason. If you want to support the show, there are two main ways you can do so. One, you can become a paid supporter. That's obviously very, very appreciated. The second way you can do is also help us land sponsors. The way you can do that is we need more subscribers. The more people who follow the show, the more sponsors we can get. So do us a favor, subscribe on Substack, leave a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and follow on YouTube. Okay, enjoy the episode.
All right, welcome to the show, Arvin. How's it going today?
It's going great. How you doing?
I am. I'm loving life. It's a sunny day in Wisconsin, and I can't ask for anything more. And I'm well caffeinated too, so everything's
There you
good.
go. There you go. On all cylinders here.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess let's just start off. Give us a quick background. Who are you, and what are you doing today?
Yeah. Hey, thanks. Thanks for having me on. I'm Arvin Ganesan. I'm the CEO of Fourth Power. We are a clean energy startup that is looking to solve the problem of how do you store solar and wind power for when the grid needs it. And we're kind of coming at this from the basic viewpoint of, the world has a huge challenge in play of powering the grid with renewable generation. The amount of storage you need is massive. So if we're going to make this transition, storage needs to be dead cheap and really easy to procure. And that's what our technology does.
And so I guess before we go, I do want to talk about your kind of journey to this point.
Yeah.
But on a macro level, you talk about the need for there to be really cheap storage. Like, can you just give us the landscape of what's there now? How are we storing it now? And what do we need the price to get to make it economic?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm glad you brought up price because ultimately the way that we choose to dispatch electrons is largely around price and reliability. Right now, the way we store electricity is either largely through hydro projects or through lithium-ion batteries. Both are not really going to be the backbone of how we scale to a fully renewable grid because, with hydro, it needs to be in a place where you have a dam. And with lithium-ion batteries, unfortunately, procuring the lithium and the other rare earth minerals that go into it is difficult and expensive. So without raising rates on people, you can't rely on mining our way out of this to get lithium. So that's kind of the technology as it is right now. But, the world will move on without storage. It'll just build more fossil. And that's the future that we're looking to avoid. We're trying to make the cost of storage so cheap that when paired with renewables, solar plus storage is going to be cheaper than building new gas plus the fuel of that gas.
Okay, got it. Yeah, that's kind of interesting. I'm always curious because I started my recruitment experience in the renewable space, and it was always interesting to see how the utilities are trying to deal with this because they they kind of have the pressure to move, but they also, it's like super expensive for them to do it. So it'll be interesting. We'll get into that in a bit. And I appreciate the high level summary. So tell us then, how did you tell us about your career? How did you end up in this role? Because you have a pretty, interesting background to end up being the CEO of this company. And I'd love to understand what made you make that leap, because I'm assuming you had other options that you could have taken.
Yeah, so I've had a career that has spanned a lot of different elements. I started off um, right out of college as a bond trader, and this is basically the furthest possible job you could have from what I had. But it wasn't what I wanted. It wasn't kind of focused on mission, though it really did help me quite a bit with understanding financial markets. I then went on, did grad school, became an advisor to a U.S. senator, and eventually was appointed by President Obama to lead policy efforts at the U.S. EPA during his first term, which was actually very consequential for the energy markets we're operating in now. At that point, coal pollution didn't have the stringent requirements of pollution control that it does now, which really has changed the way that the whole electricity market functions. I then went on to lead policy for a group of clean energy companies at a trade association, and then led global energy work for Apple. And in that role at Apple, I was helping the company as well as its suppliers procure renewables from utilities around the world. So the common thread throughout all of this is that the electricity markets are ultimately regulated markets. They're governed by regulators and by governments, and that's true whether you're in Asia or Alabama. So what I've learned super deeply is getting a product deployed is not only about building really cool technology. That's a big and important point, but you need to make sure that it works within the system that we've created, and that's how I kind of work on this day-to-day problem with Fourth Power. I wanted to leave and take a leap to a technology that mattered for really two reasons in my life. First, I wanted to be on the ground around deployment and around building something that can absolutely change the world. But second is kind of the human point. I wasn't really looking for this job, but I found a real connection with my CTO, who's the founder of the company, a professor out of MIT. I was pretty reluctant to take a CEO job because I have two small kids, and I didn't know how I could pull it off. And I was talking to a bunch of other folks as well. And when a mutual friend was like, "Hey, you should go meet this guy," I flew up to Boston, and he's like, "All right, meet me at the Cheesecake Factory at 8." I'm like, "Cheesecake Factory? I haven't been here since I was like 18 years old." So I show up, and he brings his kids. And the fact that the first time that we met was his whole family, because he didn't have childcare, at a restaurant that obviously his kids liked. It actually meant a lot, and it formed a personal connection that made the leap to this company kind of a no brainer.
Yeah, this is quite interesting. I've heard recently a candidate I worked with who said one of his core criteria is that you need to know that the founders have kids. It's a really big deal. I'm not quite in that situation yet, but it's interesting to hear this theme pop up. I am very curious what you learned through your time at Apple, because going from kind of working in the EPA and then a little bit of stint elsewhere and then going to Apple, I'm really curious what you learned that you didn't think was going to be the case, but kind of really changed the way you look at things working with Apple.
Yeah, so the electricity market is a series of pushes and pulls, right? So there's the utility that's kind of in the center, but they're facing immense pressure, not only from customers, right? Customers like Apple and other suppliers are pushing them to offer them fully renewable products. Um, and that's challenging, right? Because it is very important for a utility to service all their customers. If you're in a place like Georgia, you're going to have a tech company as your single largest purchaser of electricity. So what they want is really going to matter as a utility for Southern Company. On the other hand, utilities are really judged by their regulators for two things. They're judged for the reliability, like how are the lights turning on when you want it to come on, and the cost of electricity. So utilities, I think what I've learned is that utilities are first not monolithic, and I probably made it out to be in that little story, but also have like two very different pushes and pulls that govern how they work. And in order to get deployed, you really need to understand how the whole system works.
Hey guys, Sorry for the interruption. I just need a few seconds because Soma and I have two quick favors to ask. Putting out the show each week takes about 15 to 20 hours between us, so it's a lot of effort, and it would mean the world to us if you would leave a review and mention your favorite episode. Secondly, if you're not already, go over and subscribe to the podcast on Substack. The content is free, but if you like hanging out with us each week, maybe we're even the kind of guys you'd like to buy a coffee for on occasion, consider becoming a paid subscriber. For the cost of one lavender latte a month, you can help us immensely. Thank you for tuning in consistently and helping us to share our guest stories. Now back to the show. Yeah, I think that's it's helpful to frame it that way. I guess I hadn't thought about it from that perspective, but obviously you don't want to raise rates for all the people who are paying for their home energy, but at the same time you have to deal with the demands of these corporates. It's actually quite interesting. I never really thought about it in that way.
Well, it's like
Um,
it gets really complicated, right? Like the energy utilization of a chat GPT query is 10 times more than asking Google the same thing. So you're putting enormous
really.
stress on wherever the data centers are serving that information need, and who's paying for it, and how do you have a communal grid that's designed to service everybody, manage that amount of peak load that one or two customers utilize.
During the time, as an energy buyer with Apple, were there any major shifts in kind of the way? I'm assuming you worked with multiple utilities, right? So,
Yeah.
were there any major shifts in how they kind of started to deal with people like Apple? I mean, was this the time when you joined that the big corporates really started pushing for that renewables stuff?
Yeah, so I mean, I would say probably around 2015, right around when I joined, maybe a little bit earlier, is when corporates started setting. At that time, it was called 100% renewable. They were looking to purchase 100% renewable. Now, what that means has evolved over time, but at the time, it meant like they wanted to own certificates showing that they've purchased the amount of renewable generation that they've consumed over the entire year, and that's good. There were also a couple of moments that really kind of governed that. So, for example, in Nevada, I think in 2018, some of the largest consumers of electricity threatened to leave the utility over the ability to service a renewable load. So it became this. This was a voter referendum on retail choice. Basically, can you get rid of the utilities monopoly in Nevada? And this was a either a warning shot or the shot kind of well after the markets had been thinking about this, that really changed utilities from kind of thinking, hey, we service one load for everybody, to it's really important we keep our customers happy. And that really changed the landscape with respect to consumers.
That is fascinating. Do you have an understanding as to why? Was there another pressure that was leading the corporates, or that has kind of pushed the corporates to be wanting to do this? Is it just public sentiment? Is it investor sentiment? Like what is the push from them? Because they seem pretty bought into this at that time.
Yeah, so it's a little bit different at the time then and it was now. I think then it was like about doing the right thing
Hmm.
primarily with respect to how you consume energy, but it was also about signing long-term PPAs so your cost of energy is fixed over the long term. That's also something storage can do. But with retail rates, with natural gas, the price, kind of the price for electricity had been fluctuating quite a bit. And with renewables, you could lock in a fixed price for a long time. And some of
Mm.
the deals are really, really good. Those are the two big motivators out the gate. Now it's kind of, if you're a big user of electricity, like Microsoft, Amazon, Meta, with these data centers, it's almost a social contract because you are using so much power on the grid that without new load, without figuring out ways that the data center load doesn't affect the rest of the rate base and the rest of the grid, it becomes kind of a part of doing business.
Hmm. I'm kind of curious why. Maybe we're getting a little bit off topic to macro, but I am really curious about this as we talk. Can't it's so common that this has to run through the grid? Because if these are huge loads, wouldn't it almost behoove them to just pay a private developer to kind of do some behind the meter stuff for these large like data centers and manufacturing?
I mean, nobody has done that to date, right? I mean, I think that the idea is utilities. First, if you are a data center owner, that's a huge amount of capital expenditure that they'll be building. So they need 24/7 load and they need
Hmm.
lots of it. So that's a lot of solar, a lot of storage, all of which is great, but it's a capital intensive industry that I don't think the tech folks want to
Want
necessarily
to
get
take
into.
on themselves.
Yeah.
But would there not be private developers backed by like private equity who would be willing to finance it based off of the PPA agreements instead of kind of funneling it through the utility? Or this may be out of
It,
your scope.
there's also like very legal requirements, right? The utility
Mm-hmm.
has the right to service load to all
Mm.
customers in their service territory. This is also where kind of net metering fights
Mm-hmm.
pop up. What rate does does the utility get reimbursed by generation on a rooftop? It's not as simple as a huge data center can just like say, peace, I'm out.
Yeah.
It is
Yeah.
there are laws that govern this, and also interest from the utilities, who have a lot of
Yeah.
experience in doing this.
Yeah, it is interesting. I just kind of curious. Obviously, it is difficult to manage through those pieces, but it feels from an outsider relatively inefficient, right? Like if this is causing so much strain on the utilities because of the interconnection agreements and all this thing, and so many complications, why not just say, hey, a couple of you go ahead and do this yourself? But I understand the landslide that brings. If one person does it, then okay, maybe everybody else is going to do it, and then it causes an issue for them. So I appreciate that. Let's move on to the tech a bit. So I want to understand. You're gonna have to explain this to me like I'm five, right? How does this technology work? And let's just kind of go through it piece by piece.
Yeah, that sounds good. So, right, the core idea is to make renewables as dispatchable as fossil at a lower cost, right? So that's the north star of our technology. We go into it with a couple of fundamental principles. The first is in order to build a grid on renewable generation. So first, like I should pause by saying we are at a generational moment where electricity demand is about to go up for the first time in my lifetime, right? So it's been flat for the last 30, 40 years. It's about to go way up because of things like data centers, electrification of vehicles, all that stuff. So there's a moment here, and in order to get deployed, you need to be cheaper and more reliable than fossil. The operating principles, the amount of storage you need is so significant that you need to have the cost low as well as the supply chain for the battery to be really simple. So those are our basic principles. Okay, so with that, what are we? We are a utility scale thermal battery. What that means is, so first we're at the utility scale, which means 1 gigawatt hour battery, which is the equivalent of powering 100,000 homes continuously for 2 or 3 days. Yeah, so it's a large battery. The basic idea is the battery uses electricity either from the grid or directly from solar or wind projects to power large resistive heaters. Those resistive heaters heat up metal, so liquid tin in this case, to 2,600 degrees Celsius. And that's approaching the top of the heat that they can take without turning into a gas. So it's a very, very hot liquid. That fluid is then moved through graphite pipes deep into carbon storage blocks. The type of carbon we use is graphite. And that heat is then transferred essentially from the liquid tin medium into the middle of these graphite blocks through radiation, through light, essentially. And so these carbon blocks become ultra heated to 2,400 degrees Celsius, where they remain that way with about 1% heat loss every single day. When you want to go back to electricity, again, that fluid medium takes the heat from the carbon storage blocks and puts it into what we're calling a thermophotovoltaic block. It's essentially an area where the light from the heat is used to convert back into electricity using thermophotovoltaic panels, which we've specially designed to have the highest round trip efficiency in the world.
So
Yeah.
this is awesome. First of all, I mean, this is mind blowing. I think I do want to reference for other people if they want to go even further into the tech. There was an episode you guys did on Volt's podcast that was really, really deep into the tech at least in the first half. So I recommend if people want, check that out. Shout out to Volt. One thing I want to clarify is so try to summarize this. Basically, you take energy, in this case, obviously, ideally renewable energy. You heat up this tin, which gets so hot it's almost a liquid, but it's not quite. It goes into these pipes. That goes into a block, which only loses a little bit of heat as it just kind of sits around. And then you can basically reverse this and turn it into you take the light and you reflect it off, kind of like the sun, but it's not the sun, right?
Exactly.
Into your own energy. So is that right? First of all,
Yeah, yeah, more or less.
how do you, like, my question is, how do you reverse the transfer from the tin to the blocks and then vice versa? How do you do that work scientifically?
Yeah, so these are the basic laws of heat transfer, right? It's gonna go from hot to cold. Uh, Anytime you are bringing heat into a block, that heat is going to radiate or into something of lower temperature. That heat is going to go into that
Got
lower
it.
temperature thing and raise the temperature. And the reason we're called fourth power is that has to do with the relationship between the delta, the increase in temperature, with the increase of light. So it's not one to one. An increase of X isn't an increase of X in light, it's X to the fourth. So the hotter you get, the more light you emit, which means
Yeah.
the more electricity you can convert back into electricity.
Okay, got it. And then broadly speaking, for other people who may not be familiar with this, the principle would be when there's abundant extra, solar or wind energy, or you can take that at a very cheap rate because you have too much of it, right? And you can purchase at that price and then discharge at a better at a price that's also convenient, right? So,
Yeah. And you can pull
um,
massive amounts of electricity in like 5 minute intervals, right? It doesn't have to
really,
be
wow.
a dip for an hour, right? You can kind of grab the electricity as supply exceeds demand for 5, 10, 20, 30 minutes.
And it's as fast as you can just turn it on basically straight away
Yep.
to bring the power back. So
Yep.
that's interesting because a lot of people, if you're not familiar, if I'm not mistaken, combined cycle gas usually was like peaker plants, right? People would spin these things up, but they still take, I think, 15 minutes or something to get running, if I'm not mistaken. So that's really like crazy efficient. This is helpful. I think that's a good summary. Again, if people want more into the tech, go check out that other episode of another podcast. I want to talk about fundraising. I mean, you guys came out of stealth, basically announcing I think it's a $19 million seed round, right? Huge. I think you had Breakthrough Energy Ventures and a couple other big names. How did you do that? Like, how do you go from this? Like, what stage of technology proof did you have to go and raise this large of a seed round?
Yeah. So first, credit goes to Ashego and Henry. He's been working on this for the last 10 years, right? So he finished his PhD at MIT. He had a professorship at Georgia Tech. He'd been working on the basis of this technology for the last 10 years. And now we have all the IP rights for it. I should be very clear. But it's not like I don't, it's not like I came into this job, thought of this, and then just like went to the market and got it, right? There's a lot of work that happened in the background over the last 10 years. The reason we were very successful with this is a couple of things. First, me as the CEO and Dr. Henry as the CTO, it was a really good combination of markets and management, which I had, and scientific background, which he had. I think a lot of companies coming out of stealth have one or the other, and we were able to translate the power of what this product does into a deep understanding of who our customer is. So that package really helped, and people really matter. The dynamic that we had, the friendship that we had, was helpful in conveying the seriousness of this team and the functionality of the team. The second is we made a decision very early on. This battery could be used for heat, right? We could take all this heat and use it for industrial processes like cement or steel. But I made a decision very early on that we want to be very narrowly focused on electricity, even though that meant leaving us another market untouched. And the reason that was helpful is when you're a startup coming out of stealth and doing your first raise, having that myopic focus is not only really good for resource allocation for the limited team that you have, but it also conveys a sense of clarity to your fundraisers. The third and final reason I think we're successful is we don't exaggerate, right? Like I think that there is a sense that in order to fundraise, you need to sell the world on your dreams, but the reality is kind of hidden. I think we were fairly honest and straightforward about the possibilities of what this could mean for the world, but also, Dan, this is a first of these types of things to ever be built. When you're building something new, it's hard. So I think that there was some hubris that we didn't have going into this process, which was I think helpful for us.
I like that a lot. There's a lot of interesting things I'd maybe like to unpack further. First, I want to understand, to clarify, did you have a pilot project done early on? This was kind of just like, hey, we've got this in the lab.
We had
We
lab
figured it out here.
scale. We had lab scale demonstrations, but they're really very small. Right now, we're building a large demo.
Okay. And I guess just out of curiosity, maybe you can't speak to, maybe this is not applicable to other companies, but if you're building in hardware, something like this, is that $19 million round, like, is that going to be like more than sufficient to handle kind of the pilot project? Do you need to bring in other types of financing, like other ways that you get this built to really prove it? Because if this pilot doesn't work, then you're up a creek without a paddle. But this obviously gives you the opportunity to prove it, and then you can go raise a substantial round because now it's de-risked, right?
Yeah, right. I think that I don't have there's a one size fits all answer to that. I think that how you fundraise has to do with different technical milestones that you want to achieve, different value inflection points that you can create for your investors, and when you do the next round. And it has to do with kind of understanding where the risk stands from a technology stack perspective. Look, in an ideal world, everybody would get as much money as the world had to do their technology, but it becomes being strategic about your decisions on when and how much to raise. I think that raising too much money right away is not always good, because that comes at a certain cost if you're not if you need to raise another round if you don't hit your milestones. I think in general, going slower, more conservatively with respect to your burn rate and your technical ambitions, is a really wise place to go, even though the markets might be pushing you to like raise as much as you can and like hire as many people as you want. It becomes really difficult because growing too fast becomes a people problem. Um, the biggest opportunity and risk a small startup has is the people it hires and its ability to retain really good people.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a second. That's my favorite topic, obviously. But one thing I always think about when I see larger rounds like this, obviously, it's not like you're a software company raising a $19 million C round. That'd be absurd. But when you've raised this much money at the beginning, what are the mindset pieces that you try to maintain to make sure that you don't just blow through? Because it could probably be easy to say, okay, it looks like we're good, and you maybe get a little sloppy. Like, what are the mindset pieces that
Yeah.
you maintain as you go?
Well, I mean, first, I think that some of this stuff really needs to be top down. So, for instance, I live in Washington, D.C., but I've spent a fair bit of time in Boston where our demo is. I stay with my parents. I stay in the same same childhood bedroom that I had growing up, with like a Star Trek: The Next Generation poster above my twin size bed. So, like, there's no Ritz here. So it's, I think, really important to demonstrate that through action. But at the same time, there's going to be places where time is your worst enemy, and you need to understand the trade-offs between spending money and losing time. So, I might be able to get a part that costs 20% more, but it has, a 2-week lead time as opposed to a 6-month lead time. It is really important to be strategic in thinking about the value of money as it relates to time. So I think the basic motto is don't be penny wise, pound foolish. That austerity kind of starts from the top. We're too small to be anything but a fairly austere company when it comes to how we interact with the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think this part of this just comes with experience, right? A lot of, if you're a first time founder, just out of your PhD or something, it might be a little bit easier to just kind of not understand where to be aware, and kind of the guardrails where you gotta not run into them, and you may not have the right advisors. So I assume that a lot of it comes down to the founding team, right? And the executives. You understand, you've had some experience probably seeing other people, right?
And there's areas where underinvesting it is going to cause big problems down the road. So people, right? Getting the right people, it's really important. How you set up legal contracts and the structure, the kind of bones of your company is really important because you're going to be doing a fundraise in a couple of years, and making sure your company is set up right to succeed is really important. And doing it early is much easier than doing it like when you're a 100, 200 person company.
Yeah. Let's do this now. I think we've talked about, you've mentioned people several times. Let's get into it. I guess I want to try to do this at a high level summary. Tell me let's call it the story of building the company from a people perspective, right? Early days, and then you get some more people in. How does that look? What are the challenges? And then we'll go further from
Yeah. So the story starts before me, right? I was just I was off at Apple while this happened. It started with in about 4 years ago, 3 years ago, with Ashe essentially deciding he wants to spin this company out of MIT. And then it was called Thermal Battery Corporation. He got a 2 year leave of absence. So this is 2 years ago. 2 years leave of absence from MIT. He recruited a couple of amazing people. So he brought with him his one of the students that he was working with at MIT. He brought with him another PhD who helped stand up some important facilities at Argonne National Lab, and then another PhD from Georgia Tech. So there's a small core team of engineers that he'd brought on right away.
Did he already know all those people from his time with MIT? Like, how did he come to know those folks?
Yeah, those are all personal relationships he had. People who are willing to take a risk on him and his technology, which is awesome. And they're the core of the company right now. So the company kind of grew from 6, 7 up to a team of 17 people now, the vast majority of whom are engineers. Really, this was about making sure the team fit was right, because the thesis or the idea was when you have a team this small, you really need to have quite functional team and people whose personalities gel well together. So we really over-indexed on the engineering side on personality fits, as well as obviously backgrounds. We wanted to make sure that we're not creating chaos when chaos is in the environment around us. We don't need to be creating it.
Yeah. How many of these people that you recruited on the second, let's call it the second stage here, how many of them took a lot of convincing to kind of join this early stage, or were they just like, oh man, this is perfect, I've been interested? Like, talk to me more about that.
I think that there's, and you have a lived experience on this. I think there's an appetite for people to do big tech that solves or addresses climate change. So it is, sure, it's hard, right? Convincing people to leave any sort of job where they're modestly happy is difficult. But when you're mission aligned and it's so, in my view, clear why what we're doing is at the heart of decarbonizing the world, when you find the type of person who that's motivating to, like, well, what else do you want? So the process is always challenging for identifying those people. But if you have a compelling business that solves a problem very head on like this, types of people who are interested are going to be really interested, or not.
Yeah, they either usually are or they aren't. I'm always curious because depending on where you look, sometimes these people, like, they are interested, but it takes a while for them to warm up to the idea, because they're, especially if they're engineers, they tend to be very analytical about
Yep.
what they'll do. So with a lot of this talent, where did they come from? Did they come from existing larger companies, other startups? Were they in
Yeah.
academia? Where'd they come from?
So let's see. We got one guy out of his. So a lot of these folks are mechanical engineers, and the reason why we have selected so much for that is this is about building things with your hands, and that particular background really lends itself to building something interesting. So we recruited one fantastic person straight out of his master's program at um, at Wisconsin. Another person straight out of a master's. She came out of MIT. We brought somebody in who'd done huge capital projects for the military, somebody who worked for a large tech company, and so on and so on. I don't want to go through all their backgrounds and bore everybody, but I think the common thread is we're looking for people who like to build things and have experience building things themselves.
So it sounds like there's a relatively wide range of kind of It's called origin points, where they came from and then
Yeah.
went to Fourth Power. Out of curiosity, how did you find these people? Did you do a lot of it on your own? You engage another firm? Like, what was the kind of biggest thing that you did there that was super helpful?
So a lot of it was word of mouth, as well as kind of utilizing searches for not executive searches, but using traditional like LinkedIn type things to find certain characteristics. And it's hard. It is a full-time job to find these people, as you know. And being at the stage we were and we are, we just had to kind of scrap through it and
Yeah.
put the kids to bed and open up the computer and just start looking.
Yeah, it is a lot of work. I'm always curious because this, I mean, this stage is usually where people start to get to the point where they'll seek external support because like you just don't have time. Like before, you kind of have to make it work because there's no money in the bank really to go do it. But then you get to a certain point and you can kind of outsource that full time job, if you will. But I want to know how you talked about the importance of the cultures fitting together. Okay, this is usually extremely difficult at the beginning, right? Maybe 5, 6 people. It's relatively easy. You all interview each other, make sure everything's good. But you start to get to 10, 15 people. Beyond that, it can be challenging. So how do you make sure that you maintain a culture fit across folks without being too rigid about we only want this type of engineering big brain type. We want a couple of other folks.
Yeah, right. This is the trade-off between decision by committee and decision by kind of fiat. So one of the things we do, since we do have such a large team, and I'm going to speak specifically on the engineering side, we do interviews with panels with the engineering leaders, so all the engineering leaders, and for candidates who we kind of move quite forward with, we ask them to come in and present to the entire team. And what they present about, it doesn't have to be, in fact, it is not anything related to our product, but it's something interesting that they want to present about that shows their breadth as an engineer. It has nothing to do with the work that we do, but it's about showing us how the person thinks in the thing that they're the most comfortable working on. And the entire team engages, they ask questions, and we get a really good sense of how people think that way.
Yeah, I really like that. That's pretty fascinating. I think it's helpful to not have to be put in a bucket, especially when you're doing an interview process. Usually they want you to be a very specific person, but to recognize, hey, there's going to be other things beyond that you are interested in. Let's talk about those just to kind of get an idea of who you are. I really like that. I've never heard that one before, so I'm gonna maybe mention that to some of my partners. um,
No,
we've
I
talked,
should say it's really important that they have the qualifications to do the job.
of course.
That those are table stakes, but letting them talk about engineering challenges and problem solving in however they want to,
Yeah, other ways.
it also like allows people with different communication styles and different ways of processing information to have their best moment.
Yeah, I like this a lot. I think sometimes it's very difficult because the interview process can be boiled down to such short moments that you have a very small data set to judge off of. As you know, like it's kind of like podcasting. Podcasting is long form most of the time, and you have all these things. Maybe it's not all relevant to every listener, but you start to get a really feel of like the kind of the different texture that the person has,
Yeah,
rather than a 20-minute phone call and they say one thing that you don't like and boom, they're out.
totally. I
Um, yeah, so I like that a lot.
mean, we've all been through
Um, yeah, exactly. And it's a lot of pressure, and it can also kind of give people nerves, depending on the person. One thing we've talked about before when we were kind of preparing for this was you have a couple points around utility models. So I want to talk about how much of fourth power is, let's call it a good idea because of its fit with existing utility models. Can you talk more about that? You have a kind of some thoughts here.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, right. So I think that ultimately, something like fourth power, it is it's good. It's great for deployment, right? In addition to being a great idea, it's great for deployment. And let me kind of unpack why that matters. And this largely comes down to some pretty arcane rules about vertically integrated utilities in the United States. Utilities are allowed to earn revenue on a certain amount of money, on a certain amount of costs. What they're able to earn a rate of return on the capital costs of things they build to serve electricity. They're not allowed to earn a rate of return on the operating of those assets. So they would like, in an ideal world, as much capital going into projects as possible and as little operating expense or OpEx going into those projects. So if you build a gas plant, for example, you're going to spend X of capital to build that plant, or a vertically integrated utility would, and they're going to earn a rate of return on how much it costs to build a gas plant. But the fuel, they're not going to earn a rate of return on. And the addition of the CapEx and OpEx goes into what's called the revenue requirement, which is the total amount of money that they can spend on servicing electricity needs for the state over that year. So in an ideal world, the capital is high and the operating expense is low. But that is anathema. That is not congruent with a lot of fossil generation right now, right? You have, sure, the cost of a coal plant is high. Sure, the cost of a gas plant might be high, and that's good. But there's also high operating costs. What we bring in and why Fourth Power, I think, really fits into these core models is our what we call CapEx to OpEx ratio is great for the existing business model. The vast majority of the cost of our battery is the construction of it. There's very little cost to maintain. There's very little people time you need to maintain it. And the same is true for the cost of the renewables that power it. So ultimately, we see our battery, when paired with renewables, for example, to really fit into how utilities make money right now. It also has this really important ancillary side effect of being cheap for customers and also serving clean and reliable power. So it fits into all the things that utilities primarily care about. Lights on, electricity cheap, and now clean.
This is fascinating. So you're saying that just because of the rules, since they're regulated, like they can't just make money any way they want. They have the specific rules. They are open to spending lots of money up front, but as long as it doesn't cost a lot to operate, because they don't make any margin on the operation,
Yeah.
right? So it's really interesting. I mean, I don't know if this applies to other things, but it's probably worth noting for people listening, especially if you're building something in the space, that you maybe have low capex, but if your opex is high, you're probably screwed. Right? In the case of this current model,
it doesn't work with how utilities make money, right? There's other markets they can work on, right? They can work in non-vertically integrated markets. They can go directly to a wholesale market, in which case that might be a very good, great place for them to be. But for a vertically integrated utility or a state-run utility like you see in Asia, for example, it follows this thing that's called a revenue requirement model.
Mm-hmm. Okay. One thing I just want to understand, I think I've got this, but can you explain how you interact? Let's kind of fast forward like 5-10 years or whatever. The technology is all proven. It's just kind of like everybody's doing this, right? How does this work? How do you interact with all the other partners? Are you just a technology that you offer, kind of like Tesla offers their battery packs to developers? Are you actually going and working directly with utilities to develop the projects on their behalf? Like how does the model play out?
So I don't know. I don't know. I think that there are like 3 or 4 paths that we still have to choose from. We could be an IPP, an independent power producer, where we are generating the electricity and we're just selling it onto the grid when it makes sense. That's one path. We could sell to utilities, and utilities could own the asset. We could sell services directly to utilities, and then there's like 2 or 3 others. The reason it doesn't make sense for us to choose a path quite yet is that the markets are absolutely changing under our feet right now. And there's no real need to choose a lane in a revenue generation lane at this early stage of being a company. So it's obviously something that I think about quite a bit, and I talk to partners about quite a bit, but we're very purposefully not choosing a lane before we have to.
I like that a lot. That's quite interesting. I mean, I can imagine it poses maybe a few challenges when you're debating who you hire, because you're like, maybe we go this direction, maybe we don't know. That might be helpful, but it's probably at the end of the day, like you say, it's not the deal breaker. It's not the end of the world if you don't, because you want to figure out, once we've gone through our pilot, once we kind of have the next stage, then we can assess where things stand and then go from there.
Yeah, and the models you need to use in this space are not one size fits all, right? So how you sell into the EU, for example, or Australia is totally different than how you'd sell into a vertically integrated utility. So there's a lot of value in having as much flexibility from a business model perspective as you can to be able to tackle multiple markets.
That's probably a point for other founders in any market in climate to focus on is don't just have one potential business model, flex your brain a bit and figure out the different ways you could make money. I have noticed see with actually a number of the companies that Breakthrough has backed is that this is the case, right? There's kind of multiple revenue generation opportunities in the future. You don't have to pick early on. So I like that a lot. Maybe a theme for people to notice. One thing I do want to touch on briefly, which you mentioned early on, was you need low cost and I think you said simple supply chain.
Yeah.
Can you just talk just high level on your
Yeah.
technology and the supply chain there?
Yeah. So the guts of the battery is graphite, right? So the energy storage block we use is made out of graphite. When you think of graphite, you think about those number 2 pencils that you used for standardized tests, but trust me, it's more complicated than that. What graphite is it's just a derivative of carbon. It's a type of processed carbon. And carbon is the 10th most abundant element in the world. Coal is carbon. There are all different kinds of carbon that can be reformulated into the type of storage blocks that we're utilizing. So it's not like we're reliant on graphite or carbon to only be available from China or mined from Chile or wherever. It is in abundant form in every country in the world. So that's what I mean when I say a simple and easily accessible supply chain. We're not constrained by geography or supply.
Yeah, which is a huge issue with other energy storage systems currently. That's interesting. Especially it plays well into the idea that there's a lot of companies building carbon capture of various sorts, and perhaps you can play a role as an off taker in some of those, right? Because there is a need in the future. But that's cool. Last thing, I guess just broadly speaking, this might be a big question for the last couple of minutes we have here, but broadly speaking, do you have any particular areas where you see there to be opportunity kind of going forward? You have a pretty broad perspective on the landscape. It could be opportunities where we need more innovation to achieve the decarbonization goals, or maybe it's opportunities for efficiency in some of the markets that you play in. Like, where are some big opportunities you see?
So you mean outside of what I do day to day? So I
Yeah,
just listened to a really interesting podcast about this. I have to cross promote here,
sorry.
but it was a recent podcast on the Ezra Klein show about green growth. I don't know if you listened to that,
Mm-mm.
but it's about kind of the decoupling of economic progress with our carbon goals. And sorry, can you hear that that little ding ding?
Yeah, but it's all right.
All right, cool. Anyway, so what he gets into in this podcast, which really connected with me, was electricity, which is obviously what I'm spending my time on. Is fairly straightforward because you can give somebody something that is better, cheaper, and cleaner. You're not asking them to substitute their life. They can live a energy consuming life. They can have no real change in how their life is affected by clean energy. In fact, it probably makes their life better. But there's 30% of emissions associated with agriculture, which almost by definition requires either major innovation or people to change the way they live their lives. And this podcast made me think that some places in the ag tech space are going to be crucial for a decarbonization mission. The markets are going to be really difficult to crack, and it might be one of the more difficult wedges to crack from a decarbonization perspective. But this podcast really got me thinking of how do you decarbonize the emissions associated with agriculture? Again, has nothing to do with what I work on or what I know, but it's something I've been thinking about quite a bit.
No, I like that. I think it is. There's a lot of other co-benefits too if you can do agriculture right, where it's actually instead of adding to the problem, you're actually subtracting from the problem of emissions. So I think it is an area of interest to me, especially coming from a farming family. I should say my parents were farmers growing up. I've got time for one last thing. I think I'm going to ask you is throughout your career, I'm sure you've got to meet a lot of really interesting people. Obviously, with some of the roles you've had, who are let's just talk about one specific. Is there any one person that, if you want to name them, feel free to. If you don't want to, that's fine. But what are any people that have really inspired you in kind of the way you think, especially when it relates to climate and innovation?
That this is an easy one. I've worked for her in two regards now. It's a woman named Lisa Jackson, who was the head of EPA during the Obama years, and she's also the head of sustainability at Apple. And she's a really fascinating person. She grew up in New Orleans. Family still lives in lower ninth there. She was put through school on a petroleum scholarship, so she was a petroleum engineer. Um, and what she really taught me is ultimately deployment is about people, right? Everything we're doing, we talk about emissions, we talk about 1.5C, we talk about, I could talk about markets and capacity markets and all the things like that. But ultimately, this is about people. And the reason we need to be engaged in this is to improve the lives of people, particularly people who are having a pretty rough go of it now. And I cannot go a podcast without saying 1 in 5 people in the United States have trouble paying their electricity bills, which means that the cost of electricity is too high. And we
Mm-hmm.
need to use this opportunity for this kind of generational change moment we're at to address multiple points, including improving the lives of people in the country. She's been a mentor and a friend and a boss for quite some time.
That's great. I am a big fan of mentorship, and just, I mean, part of the reason I gravitate towards these things is I get to learn from really cool people, but also all the cool people who have come on these shows, they get to learn from cool people, and we need to pass it down. And I have this kind of side idea, or I guess you could say something that's not necessarily related to climate specifically, is that mentorship is becoming kind of a dead thing. Not as many people understand the value of actually looking behind them and helping out the folks right on their heels. And it's kind of sad because we're losing a lot of knowledge transfer in many respects. So I appreciate you sharing that. Any last thoughts, or where people should reach you, or any calls to action for the audience?
Yeah, really glad to be on. Please feel free to check us out. We're at www.goforth.com, FOURTH. This has been awesome. I really appreciate your kind of people centric approach to these organizations, because tech is, again, I say this all the time. Tech is not just built in a garage. Tech is made by people and sold by people and deployed by people. So I really appreciate the kind of way you think about this stuff.
Yeah, thanks, man. It's always helpful. It's what I do for a living, so I don't mind talking about it. I love it when other people are as passionate about it as I am. So thanks so much for that, and looking forward to what you guys continue to do. And we'll probably have you on again in a couple of years and see how things have gone.
Sounds good. Thanks.
All right, thanks for sticking around to the end, everyone. Welcome to the takeaways section. There are a lot of things I'd liked about today's conversation with Arvin, so picking a few is really hard, but here we go. First point, I'm a little biased, but the number of times he brought up people was probably a record for the show, and he did it all without me prompting him or pushing him in the direction of talent or people. So, he talked about how the combination of the right people is what helped them raise their very large seed round to get going. He talked about how people are what helped him grow his own career, in mentioning some of his mentors at the end there. He talked about how their employees help them advance, and most importantly, how no technology gets built by itself, but with people. And, as a recruiter, I really enjoy hearing his enthusiasm about the people aspect. There's not that many people, no pun intended, who genuinely understand this from what I've gathered, and the companies who seem to really get it usually have a certain kind of pizzazz to them, and understanding, and respect for the people around them. So I really like that. The second point is, and this to me is a huge, like kind of monumental takeaway. This is going to be one of the core things I've learned from doing this pod over the years, is that every founder who's building in hardware should specifically pick multiple opportunities, or business models to make their technology work. When I asked him specifically what their business model will be and how it's going to work, he straight up said, without any hesitation, I don't know. And it wasn't in a negative context. This was a positive thing, basically pointing out that, hey, we don't have to pick yet. We still have to prove the technology at a larger scale. And once we do that, we'll figure out what the markets are like at the time, and we'll move forward. He also referenced the fact that depending on where you sell, the models might have to be different, right? This is not something that's just specific to energy. It has applications across other things. So if you are a founder, I highly recommend, as you're building, as you're getting your idea going, don't necessarily pick a single business model that you're stuck to over time. Have the options. It will help you with your raise because you have more flexibility and you're not going to be tied to one, market sentiment. And as you grow, you can kind of figure out your way. I will reference that there's a few other companies that have been on this show that have been very successful who had a similar thing. And some of those to mention were Syzygy Plasmonics, Brimstone, that's also a Breakthrough Energies Ventures company, Capture 6, Divert, Energy X, and there's a few others, but those are the ones that come to mind initially. So, all right, that's all for today. If you're already a subscriber, thank you so much. Leave us a review on Apple or Spotify. If you are not already, please subscribe to the Substack, follow us, and then share, of course, with a friend. We will see you next time. Thanks for listening.